The truth is, most people misunderstand this. We walk through the world under the heavy, invisible delusion that our bank accounts, our salaries, and our credit limits are mere mathematical abstractions, simple tools designed to acquire the physical artifacts of modern success. We wake up to the jarring, relentless scream of an alarm clock while the sky is still dark, dragging exhausted bodies out of warm beds to stumble into the cold reality of the morning commute. We sit trapped in creeping lines of metal boxes on choked highways, breathing in exhaust and anxiety, gripping steering wheels with white knuckles, or we stand packed like cattle in the swaying, subterranean tunnels of public transit, all moving synchronously toward towering monuments of glass and steel. There, under the sterile, unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights, we surrender the absolute best, most vital hours of our brief, unrepeatable existence. We give away the hours when our minds are sharpest, our bodies are strongest, and our spirits are most capable of joy. And in exchange for this profound, irreplaceable sacrifice, we receive a piece of paper, a digital direct deposit, a fluctuating number on a glowing screen. We casually call this making a living. But the narrative presented in the foundational philosophy of this journey reveals a far more sinister and tragic reality. We are not making a living, we are actively, systematically making a dying. We are unconsciously participating in a grand, collective illusion where the true, finite currency of the realm has been violently obscured by the endless hum of consumerism. Into this collective somnambulism steps the archetype of the enlightened exile, embodied by the story's catalyst, a brilliant analyst named Joe. Joe was not a monk living on a remote mountain peak, nor was he an academic theorizing from the safe confines of an ivory tower. He was a creature born of the ultimate capitalist proving ground, thriving in the hyper-competitive, adrenaline-fueled heart of Wall Street. He stood at the very epicenter of global finance, surrounded daily by the dizzying, intoxicating velocity of unimaginable wealth. He watched his peers, the self-proclaimed masters of the universe, pull down astronomical salaries and year-end bonuses that defied the comprehension of the average citizen. Yet, what Joe observed with his sharp, analytical mind was not a parade of joyous, fulfilled, and liberated human beings. He saw hollowed-out ghosts draped in bespoke suits. He watched intensely driven men and women who earned millions of dollars suffer from bleeding ulcers, broken marriages, estranged children, and a pervasive, inescapable sense of existential dread that haunted their quiet moments. He saw them attempt to desperately medicate their crushing internal emptiness with external extravagance, buying sprawling, echoing mansions they were simply too busy to ever live in, purchasing pristine, multi-million-dollar yachts that never left the safety of the marina, and accumulating fleets of luxury sports cars that spent their days parked in subterranean garages while their owners toiled 70 or 80 hours a week in corner offices. Joe realized, with a chilling clarity, that these individuals were not the powerful masters of their immense wealth, they were its absolute, indentured servants. They had traded their entire conscious existence for the superficial means to maintain a lavish lifestyle that provided no actual, breathing life. This profound observation birthed the most revolutionary, paradigm-shattering concept of the entire philosophy, a concept that demands a total psychological rewiring, the absolute equivalence of money and life energy. Money is not paper printed by a government. It is not gold buried in a vault. And it is not a cryptographic digital ledger. Money is a direct, undeniable, and physical representation of your life energy. You are born with a finite, unknown, and fiercely unrenewable number of hours on this earth. When you go to work, you are not just performing tasks, you are literally selling irrecoverable fragments of your own mortality. You are exchanging the limited beats of your heart and the firing of your neurons for currency. This profound realization fundamentally changes the deep physics of every single financial transaction you will ever make. When the exhausted worker stops at the gleaming department store after a grueling, spirit-crushing week and purchases a pair of designer shoes for $300, the societal illusion cheerfully dictates that they have simply exchanged stored currency for stylish footwear. But the awakened mind, perceiving the world through the lens of life energy, understands the true, bloody mathematics of the exchange. If that worker effectively earns $15 an hour, they have not spent 300 abstract dollars, they have violently sacrificed 20 hours of their actual life energy. They have surrendered 20 hours of potential joy, 20 hours of walking in the quiet woods, 20 hours of reading to their growing children, or 20 hours of desperately needed, peaceful sleep, all for a piece of stitched leather that will inevitably wear out and be discarded in a landfill. The shoes do not cost money, they cost blood, sweat, and finite time. This cycle of trading life for objects is the ultimate trap of the modern age. To fully grasp the horrifying reality of this exchange and to shatter the cognitive dissonance, the narrative forces the individual to aggressively confront the illusion of their stated salary through the merciless, unforgiving calculation of the real hourly wage. Society comfortably tells the worker they make $50,000 a year, which translates roughly to $25 an hour on a standard payroll document. This number provides a false sense of pride and establishes a distorted, inflated baseline for lifestyle spending. But the narrative strips away this vanity with surgical precision. It demands a brutal, uncompromising financial audit of the hidden, insidious costs of employment itself. The worker must calculate the unpaid hours spent sitting in gridlocked traffic, the hours spent decompressing from the psychological trauma and toxic politics of the workplace, and the hours spent exhausted on Sunday evenings dreading the impending Monday. Furthermore, they must subtract the tangible financial costs required just to maintain the job, the cost of professional attire that they would never otherwise wear, the cost of dry cleaning, the exorbitant price of convenient, unhealthy takeout meals bought simply because there is absolutely no physical energy left to cook, the cost of the expensive escape vacations required to prevent a complete mental breakdown, and the immense, unavoidable burden of commuting costs and taxes. When this rigorous, uncompromising arithmetic is finally applied, the majestic $25 an hour violently collapses. The worker discovers, with a sickening drop in their stomach and a sudden shortness of breath, that their real hourly wage, the actual amount of unencumbered money they retain for every hour of life energy expended on the total, exhausting enterprise of their employment, is perhaps a mere $8 or $9. Suddenly, the entire calculus of modern consumerism is violently upended. The luxury car payment is no longer a celebrated status symbol. It is a literal prison sentence requiring thousands of hours of forced labor just to maintain the hollow appearance of success to strangers they do not even care about. The psychological intensity deepens dramatically as the narrative forces the seeker to undertake the very first, terrifying step of the actual methodology, the unavoidable reckoning of the past. The individual is tasked with calculating their lifetime income, an exact accounting of every single penny they have ever earned, from their very first childhood allowance or minimum wage summer job sweeping floors, all the way to their most recent, direct deposited paycheck. This number is often staggeringly large, sometimes unexpectedly reaching into the millions of dollars over a couple of decades of labor. It represents the total, cumulative volume of life energy the individual has successfully managed to convert into financial resource over their entire conscious existence. Then comes the devastating, sobering counter-calculation, the determination of their current, exact net worth. The seeker must liquidate, on paper, every single asset they own, the cash, the equity, the depreciating cars, the accumulated household clutter, and brutally subtract every single debt they carry. From the massive mortgage to the lingering, high-interest credit card balances, the resulting number is almost universally, tragically small, and in many cases, it is a terrifying negative figure. A massive, echoing chasm of missing capital stretches vast and wide between the millions of dollars earned and the meager, fragile thousands retained. This staggering gap represents the sheer volume of life energy that has been thoughtlessly squandered, leaked away over the years on forgotten restaurant meals, discarded fast fashion, obsolete technology, interest payments to faceless banks, and the relentless, gnawing friction of unconscious, habitual consumerism. The seeker sits alone in a quiet room, staring at these two numbers written on a piece of paper, feeling the crushing, suffocating weight of their own squandered mortality pressing down upon their chest. It is a moment of profound, necessary grief and deep psychological reckoning. They realize, perhaps for the very first time in their adult life, that they have been slowly bleeding out their precious life force to blindly sustain a massive economic machine that fundamentally does not care about their individual happiness, their mental health, or their ultimate survival. Analyzing this initial, explosive phase of the journey reveals a masterclass in psychological deprogramming and existential awakening. The modern capitalist system relies entirely, fundamentally, on the deliberate obfuscation of the direct connection between mindless consumption and human mortality. By keeping the worker obsessively focused on the abstract nature of currency, the artificial limits of credit scores, and the socially constructed metrics of competitive success, the system ensures a perpetual, unbroken cycle of anxious labor and desperate spending. The introduction of the concept of life energy acts as a harsh, unyielding psychological solvent, instantly dissolving the glossy, seductive veneer of corporate marketing and societal peer pressure. It forces an immediate, inescapable cognitive crisis. The individual can no longer mindlessly participate in the exhausting rat race because the true, gruesome cost of the race has been violently exposed to the light of day. The profound pain of the lifetime income calculation is not meant to induce permanent despair or paralyzing guilt, but rather to deliver a profound, galvanizing shock to the nervous system. It is the necessary, controlled demolition of the fragile financial ego. Only by standing amidst the smoking wreckage of their past financial unconsciousness, fully acknowledging the immense waste of their own life force, can the seeker begin to construct a new, highly intentional reality. The lesson extracted from this ordeal is brutally clear and empowering. Until you fiercely respect the absolute sanctity of your own finite time on this planet, you will continue to bleed it out into the waiting, greedy hands of a marketplace specifically designed to consume you. The worker is no longer just a passive, targeted consumer. They are suddenly transformed into an awakened, militant guardian of their own remaining life force, standing at the dizzying precipice of a radical, total life transformation. The heavy, invisible chains of the societal script have finally been illuminated, and the long, arduous, but deeply liberating process of unhooking those chains one by one has officially begun. The realization is terrifying in its magnitude, yet it carries the distinct, electric, and undeniable charge of impending freedom. The heavy, invisible chains of the societal script have been brilliantly illuminated by the searing light of sudden realization. But merely recognizing the cold iron of the prison is fundamentally different from undertaking the grueling, bloody work of actually walking out of the cell. The seeker now faces the immense, terrifying void of the present moment. They can no longer hide in the comforting, numbing ignorance of the past, nor can they blindly hope for a magical salvation in the future. They must become an uncompromising, relentless auditor of their own breathing existence. This monumental transformation begins with the meticulous, uncompromising tracking of every single cent that flows in and out of their daily life. This is absolutely not the restrictive, punitive, and ultimately doomed practice of traditional budgeting, which feels exactly like a starvation diet designed to induce overwhelming guilt and inevitable, explosive binge spending. Instead, it is a profound, almost spiritual practice of absolute, unblinking consciousness. The seeker begins to carry a small, worn notebook, a physical, tangible ledger of their own fleeting mortality, recording every single cup of coffee, every automated utility bill, every impulsive, emotionally driven late-night online purchase. They are no longer spending abstract, colorful paper currency or meaningless digital zeros. They are consciously spending drops of their own warm blood, irreplaceable fragments of their finite, rapidly diminishing time on this spinning earth. As the days turn into weeks, and the pages of the notebook fill with the messy, chaotic transactions of a human life, a horrifying, yet strangely beautiful clarity begins to emerge from the ink. The seeker begins to categorize these endless expenses, not into standard, sterile accounting columns like food or entertainment, but into highly specific, deeply personal, and often uncomfortable reflections of their actual lifestyle. They see the exact, staggering, and sickening amount of life energy draining away into the escape entertainment category, the expensive movie tickets, the overpriced alcohol, the frantic, Exhausting weekend getaways required simply to recover from the psychological trauma and physical exhaustion of the brutal workweek. They see the massive, silent hemorrhage of the professional appearance category. The uncomfortable suits and the expensive grooming required just to look the part of the compliant corporate drone. The notebook quickly ceases to be a mere record of finances, it becomes a brutal, unforgiving mirror, reflecting a life that is often completely, tragically misaligned with the seeker's true, internal, and most sacred values. As the seeker stares deeply into this terrifying mirror, the narrative introduces a revolutionary, paradigm-shattering psychological framework that changes everything: the fulfillment curve. Modern society relentlessly, aggressively preaches a linear, unbroken, and infinite relationship between spending money and experiencing happiness. The prevailing dogma screams that the more you consume, the happier, more successful, and more fulfilled you will theoretically be. But the seeker, intensely analyzing their own painstakingly tracked data, discovers a terrifying, undeniable bell curve hidden within the mathematics of their own life. At the very beginning of this curve, spending money on absolute, basic survival, nutritious food, safe shelter, warm clothing, brings a massive, undeniable, and deeply felt surge in human fulfillment. As spending increases to provide layers of comfort, a softer, warmer bed, a reliable, safe vehicle, a well-insulated coat, the level of fulfillment continues to steadily rise, bringing peace and security. The majestic peak of this mountain is luxury, the occasional, deeply appreciated, and highly conscious indulgence that makes the human experience feel rich, vibrant, and incredibly rewarding. But then, a dark, insidious, and deeply destructive shift occurs. As the seeker spends past the pristine point of luxury, crossing the invisible, dangerous boundary into the swamp of overconsumption, the curve begins to violently, inexorably plummet. The expensive things they buy no longer bring a rush of joy, they bring a heavy, suffocating burden. The fourth massive television requires complex wiring and constant troubleshooting. The significantly larger house demands exhausting cleaning and exorbitant, terrifying heating bills. The overflowing, chaotic closet induces daily decision fatigue and a paralyzing sense of physical and mental clutter. The seeker realizes they are literally renting external concrete storage units just to house the physical manifestations of their wasted life energy, creating a tragic, silent museum of impulsive decisions. They realize, with a sickening jolt of absolute clarity, that they are actively, voluntarily spending their precious, unrenewable life energy to literally purchase anxiety, chronic stress, and physical exhaustion. The Holy Grail, the ultimate, shining objective of this profound financial awakening, is the discovery of the absolute peak. Enough. Enough is fundamentally not a state of deprivation, scarcity, or miserable poverty. It is the absolute, vibrant, and powerful pinnacle of the fulfillment curve. It is having exactly what is perfectly needed for a deeply fulfilling, rich life, and aggressively, ruthlessly, and joyfully eliminating every single possession, subscription, and expense that falls on the toxic, downward slope of overconsumption. The seeker learns the hard, bloody lesson that crossing the peak of enough is not a triumphant elevation of social status, but a tragic, self-funded descent into a psychological and material prison. To relentlessly, violently defend this sacred peak of enough from the endless siege of advertising and societal expectation, the seeker must subject every single category of their monthly spending to a brutal, uncompromising, and deeply philosophical interrogation using the methodology of the 3 questions. They sit alone at their kitchen table at the quiet end of the month, the thick ledger of their expended life energy spread out before them like a map of a battlefield. And they ask the first, piercing, and unforgiving question: did I actually receive deep fulfillment, genuine value, and lasting joy in exact, mathematical proportion to the irreplaceable life energy I just spent? When looking at the hundreds of hours of grueling, soul-crushing life energy traded over the years for a depreciating luxury car loan, the honest answer might be a resounding, sickening, and deeply painful no. The psychological high of canceling a subscription that drained life energy is quickly discovered to be far more intoxicating than the momentary thrill of the original purchase. The second question cuts even deeper. slicing through the superficial layers of ego straight into the core of the soul. Is this specific expenditure of my finite life energy in absolute, perfect alignment with my deeply held internal values and my ultimate, true life purpose? The seeker, who vocally claims to value environmental sustainability, deep familial connection, and quiet peace, stares at the ledger and realizes with horror that their money is frantically flowing towards disposable fast fashion, high-carbon convenience, and 60-hour work weeks that keep them entirely alienated from their growing children. The cognitive dissonance generated by this realization is excruciating, forcing an immediate, radical, and total realignment of their daily behavior. The final question projects the seeker out of their current trapped state and into a bright, liberated, and radically different future. How would this exact expenditure fundamentally change if I absolutely didn't have to work for a living anymore? They realize, with a sudden burst of joyous laughter, that the expensive dry cleaning for suits they hate, the exorbitant, soul-draining commuting costs, and the pricey, unhealthy convenience meals would instantly, permanently vanish into thin air if they truly owned their own time. The three questions act as a razor-sharp, surgical scalpel, meticulously and ruthlessly cutting away the cancerous, unconscious spending habits that have kept the seeker trapped on the endless, exhausting treadmill of modern survival. But the profound internal psychological shift, no matter how powerful, must be aggressively manifested into the physical, tangible world to ensure permanent, unyielding, and inescapable accountability. The seeker constructs a massive, glaring, and deeply symbolic visual representation of their ongoing awakening, the wall chart, placed in a highly visible, impossible to ignore location in their home. This chart becomes the sacred altar of their financial and spiritual transformation. It is not done on a hidden digital spreadsheet, but on physical, oversized paper, demanding a tactile, bodily engagement with their own financial truth. The physical act of drawing the line becomes a bold declaration of independence, a quiet rebellion against a system perfectly designed to keep them blind. On the vertical axis, they meticulously plot the volume of money, representing thousands of dollars, and on the horizontal axis, the relentless passage of time measured in months and years. Every single month, with the solemn, unwavering devotion of a monk participating in a sacred ritual, the seeker plots two distinct, vital lines. The first line is their total monthly income, the raw, quantified amount of life energy they have successfully harvested from the world. The second line is their total monthly expenses, the exact, calculated amount of life energy they have consumed to maintain their existence. In the terrifying beginning of this process, these two lines are dangerously, uncomfortably close together, dancing in a tight, suffocating embrace that perfectly represents the fragile, desperate, paycheck-to-paycheck reality of the exhausted modern worker. But as the seeker relentlessly, fiercely applies the powerful filter of the three questions, as they ruthlessly eliminate the toxic, downward slope of the fulfillment curve from their daily life, something completely miraculous begins to happen on the physical chart. The expense line begins to drop. It drops not out of a sense of punishing deprivation or miserable sacrifice, but out of a profound, joyous, and incredibly light liberation from meaningless, heavy consumption. Simultaneously, the seeker, now hyper-aware of the absolute, sacred value of their ticking time, begins to aggressively optimize their income, absolutely refusing to trade their precious life energy for anything less than it is fundamentally worth, causing the income line to rise with newfound strength. A massive, beautiful, and breathtaking gap begins to open up between the two lines on the graph. This growing, empty space is not merely accumulated capital sitting in a bank, it is captured, hoarded, and concentrated freedom. It is the physical, visual manifestation of life energy that has been heroically saved from the roaring incinerator of mindless consumerism. Analyzing this profound, deeply transformative middle phase of the journey exposes the true, incredibly insidious nature of modern economic enslavement and reveals the exact, precise, and foolproof mechanics of ultimate escape. The global economic engine is perfectly, flawlessly, and maliciously designed to keep the individual entirely unconscious, encouraging a state of perpetual financial amnesia where the simple, Effortless swipe of a plastic credit card instantly and permanently disconnects the physical pain of labor from the fleeting psychological pleasure of acquisition. By forcing the individual to manually, painstakingly track every single transaction and translate it directly back into the biological currency of their own finite time, the philosophy violently, irrevocably shatters this carefully constructed amnesia. The tracking process is deeply, fundamentally subversive to the entire capitalist structure. It magically transforms the passive, victimized, and highly manipulatable consumer into a highly conscious, fiercely defensive, and heavily armed auditor of their own mortality. Furthermore, the introduction of the fulfillment curve completely destroys the toxic, ubiquitous, and deeply ingrained societal myth that more is always better. It proves, mathematically, biologically, and psychologically, that more is very often the exact root cause of our deepest, most profound misery, actively and aggressively degrading the quality of our lives while simultaneously demanding vastly more of our precious life energy just to sustain it. The three questions serve as an impenetrable, towering psychological firewall, completely preventing the relentless, deafening bombardment of corporate advertising and subtle peer pressure from ever again dictating the individual's spending behavior. The seeker is no longer a fragile leaf blown about by the chaotic, unpredictable winds of marketing trends and societal expectations. They are an immovable, sovereign entity, allocating their life energy with the lethal, calculating precision of a master sniper. The wall chart acts as the ultimate psychological reinforcement mechanism, turning the abstract, terrifying, and seemingly impossible concept of complete financial independence into a highly visible, trackable, and deeply motivating physical game. It brilliantly gamifies human survival and heavily weaponises the concept of hope. The individual can literally, physically see their absolute freedom expanding inch by inch on the massive graph paper, generating a massive, compounding, and utterly unstoppable wave of internal momentum. The agonizing, blind, and desperate struggle of the past has been permanently, beautifully replaced by a crystal clear, highly empirical, and absolutely undeniable trajectory toward complete and total liberation. The seeker has successfully stopped the catastrophic bleeding of their life force, patched the holes in their psychological hull, and has built a robust, impenetrable, and highly efficient system to aggressively defend their future, perfectly setting the grand stage for the final, ultimate, and deeply triumphant pinnacle of the crossover point, where the massive reserves of captured life energy will be finally deployed to permanently, violently sever the heavy iron chains of mandatory labor forever. The massive, beautiful, and breathtaking gap that begins to open up on the sacred wall chart, representing the captured, hoarded, and fiercely protected life energy of the seeker, is not meant to simply sit idle in a sterile bank vault, slowly eroding under the silent, invisible, and relentless theft of economic inflation. The seeker, now operating with the lethal precision, absolute clarity, and unyielding discipline of an awakened master of their own destiny, realizes that this accumulated surplus is fundamentally different from the frantic, desperate, and fleeting cash of their past existence. This newly formed gap is absolute, concentrated power. It is seed capital in the truest, most biological, and profoundly potent sense of the word. The narrative introduces the profound, transformative, and deeply psychological alchemy of investment, but it aggressively, violently rejects the adrenaline-fueled, hyper-anxious, and deeply destructive gambling mentality that characterizes modern-day trading and speculative, chaotic financial markets. The seeker absolutely does not throw their hard-won, irreplaceable life energy into the chaotic, unpredictable volatility of risky, unproven ventures, because they now understand exactly how much literal blood, sweat, and finite time that capital mathematically represents. Instead, they seek absolute, impenetrable safety and steady, guaranteed, and reliable yield. They deploy their precious capital into robust, unshakable, and historically proven vehicles, the unyielding safety of government treasury bonds or the broad, unstoppable, and deeply diversified momentum of low-cost market index funds, creating an entirely new, miraculous, and self-sustaining entity in their personal financial ecosystem. This deployed capital begins to generate its own independent, autonomous life energy, producing a steady, reliable, and continuously flowing stream of passive income that requires absolutely zero physical labor, zero psychological exhaustion, and zero surrender of precious time from the seeker. A third, breathtakingly important, and highly symbolic line is meticulously introduced to the sacred, oversized wall chart hanging in their home. This specific line begins at the very bottom of the horizontal axis of the graph. A tiny, almost imperceptible, and highly fragile creeping trajectory of passive income, birthed entirely from the compounding interest and relentless dividends of their diligently deployed capital. In the very beginning of this agonizingly slow process, this new line is incredibly weak, perhaps only generating enough autonomous life energy to cover a single, insignificant utility bill or a meager week of groceries. But the seeker watches this third line with the fierce, protective, and intensely emotional devotion of a parent watching a child take its first, hesitant, and staggering steps, because they know, with absolute, unshakable, and mathematical certainty, the staggering, world-altering, and liberating destiny that this specific, creeping line ultimately represents. Month after grueling month, year after relentless, highly disciplined year, the seeker ruthlessly, joyfully maintains their deeply entrenched position at the majestic, vibrant peak of the fulfillment curve, keeping their expense line perfectly flat, beautifully optimized, and entirely, permanently insulated from the toxic, creeping, and ubiquitous disease of modern lifestyle inflation. Simultaneously, they relentlessly, aggressively pour every single available drop of their monthly surplus life energy into their chosen investment vehicles, causing the underlying capital base to grow with a terrifying, compounding, and utterly unstoppable velocity. The third line on the wall chart, the glorious, independent line of autonomous, passive investment income, begins its relentless, triumphant, and exponentially accelerating ascent. It continuously climbs the vertical axis of the graph, inching closer and closer, month by month, to the flat, remarkably stable, and deeply satisfying line of the seeker's carefully calculated and highly optimized living expenses. The psychological anticipation building within the mind and soul of the seeker rises to an agonizing, electric, and utterly intoxicating crescendo. They are no longer a passive, terrified victim merely hoping for a distant, traditional retirement at a federally mandated age of physical decay and mental exhaustion. They are an active, aggressive, and highly lethal architect engineering their own immediate, non-negotiable emancipation from the industrial machine. The empty, white space between the rapidly rising line of passive income and the stable, horizontal line of required survival expenses grows microscopically, agonizingly thin. The seeker can physically, viscerally feel the heavy, iron, and deeply oppressive gravitational pull of the mandatory labor market beginning to violently weaken and completely lose its terrifying grip on their psyche. The soul-crushing, paralyzing fear of an arbitrary corporate layoff. The suffocating, daily anxiety of dealing with a displeased, tyrannical manager. The deeply ingrained, generational terror of sudden, catastrophic destitution. All of these ancient, paralyzing phobias begin to rapidly evaporate into thin air like morning mist burning away under a brilliant, blazing sun. The seeker walks through the sterile, fluorescent lit, and highly monitored corridors of their workplace not as an indentured, frightened servant desperate for the next biological life support payment, but as a sovereign, immensely powerful entity who is merely visiting, a fully autonomous human being who currently holds the absolute, undeniable, and immediate power to walk out the glass doors forever at any given, chosen moment without a single shred of fear. And then, upon one quiet, seemingly ordinary, and fundamentally unremarkable day, the profound, earth-shattering, and profoundly beautiful mathematical inevitability finally occurs. The seeker stands silently before the sacred, heavily marked wall chart, the worn, ink-stained marker trembling slightly in their sweating hand, and they plot the final, necessary monthly data points. The rising, triumphant, and totally unstoppable line of passive investment income violently, decisively intersects and then immediately breaches the flat, stable, and deeply optimized line of their total monthly living expenses. This is the magnificent, legendary, and highly coveted crossover point. It is the absolute, unquestionable holy grail, the shining, ultimate zenith of the entire arduous, transformative philosophical journey. The seeker stares intensely at the exact physical intersection of those two drawn lines. And the sheer, unfathomable, and utterly massive magnitude of the moment washes over them in a crashing, overwhelming, and deeply emotional wave of profound realization. The physical walls of their home seem to completely dissolve. The suffocating, heavily conditioned constraints of modern time and mandatory labor instantly, permanently vaporize, and a terrifying, beautiful, and absolutely boundless expanse of pure, unadulterated freedom violently opens up before them, stretching endlessly into the distant horizon of their remaining life. The crossover point is absolutely not merely a financial, mathematical milestone recorded on a piece of paper. It is a profound, irreversible, and deeply spiritual biological and psychological rebirth of the human entity. The seeker has officially, undeniably, and mathematically achieved absolute financial independence. From this exact, defining, and glorious second forward, until the final, natural, and peaceful beat of their heart, they will never, ever be forced by societal necessity or biological desperation to trade another single drop of their precious, finite, and unrenewable life energy for money simply to survive on this planet. The terrifying, primal survival imperative has been completely, permanently, and flawlessly outsourced to the autonomous, silent, and relentlessly efficient machinery of their accumulated, deployed capital. The heavy, rusting, and deeply painful chains of the modern industrial and corporate prison completely shatter, falling to the floor with a deafening, invisible, and deeply satisfying crash. The seeker is entirely, unconditionally, and terrifyingly free. Analyzing the devastating, profound psychological impact of the crossover point actively exposes the ultimate, catastrophic, and deeply hidden vulnerability of the global consumerist machine. The entire, towering, and seemingly invincible edifice of modern economic exploitation relies entirely, fundamentally upon the individual worker remaining in a perpetual, unbroken state of deep financial fear and total dependency, forever exhausted by chasing an ever-receding, deliberately manufactured horizon of artificial, meaningless needs, by rigorously, philosophically redefining the ultimate concept of what is truly enough, and successfully deploying captured life energy to perfectly, seamlessly cover that deeply satisfying, non-toxic baseline. The seeker essentially unplugs themselves entirely from the coercive matrix of forced, mindless consumption. They fundamentally, permanently destroy the coercive, threatening power of the corporate employer and the seductive, highly manipulative power of the global advertiser in one single, mathematically undeniable, and incredibly powerful stroke. The realization of the crossover point is the ultimate, profound act of peaceful, devastating, and deeply personal rebellion against a broken system. It proves, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the crushing, exhausting, and spirit-breaking timeline of working 40 or 50 hours a week for 40 continuous, grueling years is absolutely not a biological necessity, a rigid law of nature, or a mandatory human duty, but a highly optional, tragically inefficient, and totally, completely avoidable societal construct designed to harvest human time. The realization of financial independence forces an immediate, radical, and breathtaking elevation of the basic human condition. The individual is violently thrust out of the frantic, desperate, and animalistic realm of basic survival and thrust directly, without any safety net, into the terrifying, magnificent, and entirely open-ended realm of pure self-actualization. They are no longer a human doing, strictly defined by their arbitrary corporate job title, their perceived social status, and their capacity to endlessly produce corporate profit for unseen shareholders. They have successfully, triumphantly returned to their natural, original, and deeply sacred state as a human being, completely sovereign over the remaining minutes, hours, and days of their fleeting, beautiful, and totally unrepeatable mortality. But the narrative aggressively, urgently warns that crossing this monumental, life-altering threshold is absolutely not the end of the journey. It is, in profound fact, the terrifying, blank, and completely unwritten canvas of a completely new, vastly more complex beginning. Modern society falsely, maliciously teaches that the ultimate, shining goal of accumulated wealth is a permanent, unbroken state of absolute, hedonistic lethargy, sitting endlessly on a white sand tropical beach, mindlessly consuming colorful cocktails, and actively, intentionally avoiding all forms of physical, mental, and spiritual exertion. But the awakened seeker, having successfully achieved this monumental, hard-won freedom, quickly discovers that a life completely devoid of deep purpose, difficult challenge, and meaningful contribution to the world is just another, far more insidious, and deeply depressing form of psychological death. The profound, driving question of the seeker's daily existence violently, irrevocably shifts from the anxious, "How do I make a living?" to the far more terrifying, massive, and deeply existential question of, "What exactly is my finite life fundamentally for?" The massive, roaring, and previously constrained river of human life energy, previously dammed up and forcefully, unnaturally diverted into the sterile, fluorescent, and suffocating cubicles of the corporate machine, is now entirely unleashed, flowing freely and powerfully under the absolute, conscious, and highly intentional direction of the seeker. They absolutely do not stop working, they simply, profoundly stop working for money. The massive, fundamental distinction between these two states is absolutely everything. They aggressively, joyfully redirect their liberated, boundless, and fully recharged life energy toward the deep, passionate, and heavily impactful pursuits that the toxic, exhausted, and time-starved constraints of the 9-to-5 grind had previously made absolutely, physically impossible to maintain. The seeker, completely, irrevocably unburdened by the terrifying, paralyzing specter of poverty or sudden destitution, plunges headfirst into the active, aggressive healing of their own fractured, hurting community, volunteering massive, completely uncompensated, and deeply rewarding hours to local environmental restoration projects, patiently mentoring the desperate, wandering, and forgotten youth of their city, or pouring their immense, liberated intellect and raw emotion into the creation of profound, challenging, and entirely non-commercial art. They begin to actively, aggressively heal the deep, lingering physical and psychological wounds inflicted upon their own bodies by decades of chronic, unrelenting stress, rediscovering the sheer, unadulterated, and profoundly biological joy of natural movement, deep, authentic human connection, and unbroken, peaceful, and utterly silent contemplation. They use their absolute, impenetrable financial invincibility to speak dangerous, uncomfortable, and desperately needed truths to entrenched, corrupt power structures, because they absolutely cannot be fired, cannot be intimidated, and cannot be economically coerced or silenced by any external force. They deeply realize that the true, ultimate, and highest purpose of capturing and hoarding their life energy was never to simply escape the painful, grinding reality of the world and hide in a fortified bunker, but to gather enough strength, sovereign power, and unshakable freedom to turn around and actively, joyfully, and fearlessly participate in the mending of it. The ultimate, transcendent realization of the philosophy dawns upon the seeker with the overwhelming warmth and blinding brilliance of a rising sun. Financial independence is absolutely not a selfish, isolated, and cowardly retreat from the heavy duties of human existence. It is the ultimate, profound, and absolutely necessary empowerment required to finally, authentically, and powerfully contribute to the collective survival, healing, and flourishing of the human race. The seeker has successfully, beautifully evolved from a frantic, exhausted, and highly manipulated consumer of global resources into a grounded, deeply powerful, and endlessly generative source of immense, radiating positive impact. The ultimate, earth-shattering meaning that this profound narrative fiercely intends to convey to its readers is a revolutionary, uncompromising manifesto of absolute existential reclamation. The core, beating message is that the prevailing, globally accepted narrative of the modern economy is a tragic, highly destructive, and carefully engineered illusion designed to silently extract your most precious, absolutely unrenewable resource, your finite, ticking mortality, in exchange for a hollow, endless, and deeply unfulfilling cycle of meaningless consumption and chronic, suffocating stress. The book serves as a profound, transformative psychological and mathematical blueprint, teaching that by aggressively, relentlessly recognizing money as the direct, literal, and undeniable equivalent of your own warm blood and life energy, and by ruthlessly optimizing your existence around the vibrant, majestic peak of absolute fulfillment, you can effectively hack the system and buy back your own soul. The final, transcendent lesson is one of radical, terrifying, and beautiful empowerment. You possess the absolute, undeniable, and immediate power to permanently step off the grinding, bloody treadmill of mandatory labor, fundamentally transforming your brief, fragile existence from a desperate, exhausted transaction of survival into a magnificent, sovereign, and deeply purposeful masterpiece of human liberty. You are not a machine built to endlessly consume the world, you are a brief, beautiful spark of consciousness, and your time is the only true wealth you will ever possess.